Drifting into the world of native sleep. Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift a little outside of our usual parade of royal meltdowns and dynastic disasters. Don't worry, there's still plenty of weirdness ahead, just in a different flavor. So dim the lights, pull up a blanket, and settle in. Because tonight's little bedtime exploration asks a question you probably never thought would keep you awake. How exactly did Native Americans sleep in tents? And before you say, well, on the ground, obviously, let's remember that humans are endlessly inventive when it comes to comfort. Even in societies without memory foam, lavender sprays, or overpriced ergonomic pillows, people still manage to sleep, somehow. Now, the stereotype that often floats around is of the Indian tent, usually imagined as a tall teepee with smoke curling out the top, everyone cozily tucked inside. And sure, sometimes that was true. But just like today, there wasn't one single Native American bedroom standard. Geography mattered, climate mattered, cultural traditions mattered. The Lakota on the plains weren't sleeping in the same setup as the Iroquois up in the forests, or the Navajo in the desert southwest. So, if you were hoping for a single universal answer, sorry, history doesn't do simple answers. It prefers to hand us a buffet of slightly confusing ones. Let's start with the teepee, or teepee if you prefer to spell things the way your third-grade textbook did. This is probably the most famous native structure, and it belonged mostly to the Plains tribes, the Lakota, Dakota, Blackfoot, Cheyenne, Crow, Comanche. Basically, people who needed something portable. Because when your neighborhood is hundreds of miles of grass and buffalo herds that keep moving, you don't exactly want to lug around a log cabin on your back. So, a teepee it was. Poles arranged in a cone, covered in animal hides, usually buffalo. And yes, if you're already imagining that setup as drafty and uncomfortable, congratulations, you've officially never lived before the age of insulation. But actually, teepees were brilliant. The hides overlapped like shingles, blocking wind and rain. A lining inside created a sort of chimney effect, drawing smoke from the central fire straight upward and out. And on winter nights when the Great Plains could become an open-air freezer, families banked fires inside and insulated the ground with brush, mats, and furs. People didn't just flop down on bare dirt, despite the Hollywood image. They layered. They were survivalists before glamping influencers tried to sell you the idea for $500 a night. So what did a sleeping arrangement in a teepee actually look like? Picture the cone. Around the circular interior, families arranged themselves in little sections. Bedding wasn't standardized, obviously. No one was popping down to IKEA for a Malm bed frame. But there were mats woven from grasses, laid over hide, with more hides piled on top. Think of it as a cross between a floor mattress and a very determined fur coat. People slept bundled together, both for warmth and practicality. Babies, of course, had their famous cradle boards, swaddled and strapped in ways that make modern parents on parenting blogs gasp in horror, but somehow generations of babies survived. Because yes, strapping your infant to a board was actually safe and kept them out of trouble while the adults got on with life. Now, pause, because at this point you might be wondering, didn't it get smoky? Didn't it get uncomfortable? And the answer is yes, of course it did. But so does your apartment when you forget to open a window while making spaghetti. Humans have tolerated worse. The central fire gave light, heat, and a way to cook without going outside in a blizzard. People slept with that background crackle, like nature's version of a white noise machine. Or, if you prefer, the original ASMR. Let's drift over to another style, the wigwam. Not the same as a teepee, despite Hollywood laziness. The wigwam was more of a dome shape, semi-permanent, often used by Algonquin-speaking tribes in the northeast woodlands. If a teepee was a conical hat,
A wigwam was a rounded turtle shell. Covered with bark or mats of reeds, these were snug little shelters that held warmth far better in damp climates. Inside, the sleeping arrangements again came down to mats, skins, and layers. No one was buying thread-count sheets, but softness came from furs, and layering hides created padding. And let's not forget the Southwest. The Navajo, Hopi, and Pueblo peoples had hogans, adobe houses, and multi-story dwellings that looked like apartment complexes long before Europeans showed up and acted like they'd invented architecture. Sleeping there could mean stretched-out mats on earthen floors, or in Pueblo homes, even upper levels. In the desert heat, night temperatures dropped sharply, so blankets and furs were as essential as in the north. Now, here's the thing. Whenever we modern people think about sleeping in tents without modern comforts, our brains instantly translate that into terrible. But remember, humans are endlessly adaptable. If you grow up sleeping on firm mats with layered hides, that feels normal. Your spine adjusts. And ironically, many anthropologists today argue that modern humans could learn a thing or two from pre-industrial sleeping. Flat, firm surfaces, side sleeping with knees bent, using the body as insulation instead of 10 pounds of artificial bedding. In fact, some of the chronic back pain plaguing us today, probably a byproduct of mattresses so plush they practically swallow you. Congratulations, your $1,000 mattress may be making you less comfortable than a deer hide on woven reeds ever did. Of course, let's not romanticize too hard. Were there bugs? Absolutely. Drafts? Constantly. Did people occasionally wake up with frost crusting the inside walls of a teepee? Yes. But sleeping was never about perfection. It was about survival, warmth, and enough rest to keep hunting, gathering, or raiding the next day. Nobody expected a spa experience. And in a way, that simplicity makes the whole thing sound a little, well, peaceful. Let's float to another small but amusing note: sleep positions. Anthropologists suggest many native groups practiced what's called segmented sleep. That means sleeping in two stretches, with a waking period in the middle of the night. You'd sleep for a few hours, wake for an hour or two, stoke the fire, maybe talk quietly or do some chores, and then drift back down again. And before you laugh at that as primitive insomnia, keep in mind pre-industrial Europeans did the exact same thing. The whole 8 hours straight standard is actually modern. So in a teepee or wigwam, segmented sleep was probably normal. And honestly, lying awake staring at the glowing embers while your relatives snored around you, that sounds almost soothing. Now, since we're telling sleepy history, let's not forget the irony of how Europeans reacted when they saw native sleeping arrangements. To them, it looked savage and unrefined. But let's check the record. 16th century French peasants were sleeping 3 to a straw mattress, often with livestock in the same room. English cottages had smoky fires in the middle of dirt floors with no chimney, leaving people coughing through the night. So when colonists looked at a wigwam with a vented roof and layered bedding and called it uncivilized, that was mostly projection. If we're grading sleeping conditions, I'm not sure an average English peasant would come out on top. And with that gentle reminder that history is always more ironic than we expect, let's pause. In Part 2, we'll drift into the details: how native children were kept warm, the symbolism behind certain bedding choices, and even how Europeans sometimes ended up copying native sleeping setups. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that people are quick to sneer at something right before they steal it.
Children, comfort, and the strange ironies of sleep. So, where were we? Yes, nestled somewhere between buffalo hides, smoldering embers, and the occasional draft sneaking in through a seam. Let's gently roll over and talk about children. Because if adults sleeping in furs and mats seems rough, You're probably wondering what on earth happened to babies and toddlers in a world without bassinets from Target. Well, this is where cradle boards enter the picture. You've probably seen them in old illustrations. Babies swaddled tightly, strapped upright to a wooden frame like tiny immobilized astronauts on standby. To modernize, it looks borderline medieval. But cradle boards were ingenious. They kept infants secure, allowed mothers to carry them hands-free, and even let the little ones be propped near fires at night. Think of it as the original baby carrier/bed. And despite the modern parenting blogs gasping, cradle boards didn't hinder development. In fact, some anthropologists argue that swaddling and immobilization made infants calmer, which makes sense when your biggest threat in life is rolling into a fire pit. At night, a cradle board might be leaned against the side of the lodge or even laid flat beside the parents' bedding. And because communities were often large family groups, there were always extra eyes to keep track of small children. Crying infants weren't isolated in a separate nursery with the baby monitor. They were right there, wrapped up, and probably soothed by the warmth of a communal fire and the soft snoring of a half-dozen relatives. If you're imagining chaos, you're not entirely wrong. But remember, people adjusted. For thousands of years, this was the normal lullaby. And children didn't stay in cradle boards forever. Once they were toddling, they had their own miniature bedding, small furs, mats, or even just shared piles with presents. Remember, this was communal life. The idea of everyone having a private bedroom, decorated in a theme, with a personalized bed frame, is a very modern and very Western thing. For most of history, including native North America, sleep was collective. You dozed off surrounded by family, by extended kin, by the occasional dog curled up nearby. Privacy wasn't the priority. Survival warmth was. Speaking of dogs, yes, they sometimes doubled as living hot water bottles. Many native groups kept dogs, not only for hauling small loads or alerting against danger, but also for warmth. On freezing nights, a pile of fur-covered canines was as good as an extra blanket. And if you're rolling your eyes, consider the fact that plenty of us today let our pets climb into bed for comfort. History just did it with fewer memory foam options. Now, let's drift into another detail: the bedding itself. Furs and hides weren't just practical, they were symbolic. Certain animals carried meaning. Buffalo hides, for example, weren't just warm, they represented the very heart of life for Plains people. Sleeping under one was both a necessity and a continuation of a cultural bond. Deer hides, bear skins, woven reeds from reeds, all of these tied people not just to comfort, but to the ecology around them. Compare that to us today, where the most symbolic our bedding gets is whether the tag says organic cotton. But let's be honest, sleeping under hides wasn't always glamorous. They had to be scraped, tanned, softened. Sometimes they smelled. Sometimes they harbored fleas or other unwelcome guests. Life in pre-industrial times was always a negotiation with the natural world, and sleep was no exception. You could have the coziest setup possible and still wake up scratching, which, let's face it, is exactly what happens to you today after one night in a budget hotel. All right, so far we've talked about babies, bedding, and family piles of warmth. But how about the architecture itself? Because while tipis and wigwams are famous, there's a deeper layer of irony here. Europeans often mocked native dwellings as primitive, while simultaneously choking in the smoke of their own stone huts with no ventilation. The tipi, in particular, was an engineering marvel. It had an adjustable smoke flap at the top, meaning people could literally control airflow by moving poles tied to ropes. Rain, snow, wind, there was an answer for that. Meanwhile, English peasants were still building one-room cottages where everyone slept with the cow to avoid freezing to death. Yet somehow the judgment always went one way. And the funniest part, colonists actually began copying native designs when they realized they worked better. Soldiers, trappers, and explorers often adopted wigwam-style shelters or lean-tos because they were more efficient than European tents. Yes, the same savage structures mocked in travel diaries quietly got recycled by the very people writing those insults. History is nothing if not consistent in its hypocrisy. Let's pause on another overlooked piece: climate, because sleeping in North America wasn't the same everywhere. On the Great Plains, winters were brutal, summers scorching. Fires, hides, and clever ventilation made all the difference. In the humid Southeast, tribes like the Cherokee built winter houses, circular, mud-covered structures partially dug into the earth. Imagine going from an open-air teepee to a snug, insulated pit house. Entire families huddled inside, sleeping on raised benches covered in mats and skins. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. Meanwhile, in the Southwest, Pueblo people built thick adobe walls that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. They sometimes even slept on rooftops in the hot months, staring up at the stars long before rooftop patios were trendy. And speaking of stars, sleeping wasn't always indoors. Hunting parties, travelers, or anyone caught away from home made do with the most ancient bed of all, the ground. But again, humans adapted. Pine boughs, grass, or woven mats kept people off damp soil, and furs or cloaks completed the picture. If you're picturing something miserable, remember that some people today actually pay money to go primitive camping and brag about it online. The difference is that native groups did it as a matter of daily life without feeling the need to post selfies about how rustic they were. Another small sleepy irony: segmented sleep. We touched on it earlier, but let's stretch it out. Many anthropologists believe that before the Industrial Revolution, virtually everyone practiced two-phase sleep. Natives, Europeans, Africans, across cultures. People dozed for a few hours, woke in the night, then went back down. The middle of the night wake time was for stoking fires, whispering conversations, or even quiet reflection. Imagine it, lying on a fur mat, listening to the crackle of fire and the breathing of relatives while outside the wind howls. You're not panicking about insomnia. You're simply living within a rhythm humans had followed for millennia. In a way, it sounds more natural than the 8-hour blocks we demand today. Now let's drift towards a slightly humorous image: Europeans arriving and absolutely losing their minds over how uncomfortable native life must be. They wrote endless travelogues about the supposed suffering of people sleeping in hides on mats. Meanwhile, these same gentlemen were scratching themselves raw in lice-ridden straw mattresses back home. One English visitor even remarked on how savage it seemed that natives slept communally around a fire. The irony? That was literally what most peasants in Europe did too, just with worse ventilation. It seems that once you slap the label civilized on yourself, you can ignore the fact that your bedroom smells like goat. So if we gently wrap up this second section, what if we really learned that native sleep wasn't primitive, it was practical, it was communal, it was adapted to environment, culture, and survival. It was layered hides and mats, cradle boards for babies, fires for warmth, stars for summer. It was dogs curled up like furry heaters. It was segmented hours and whispered midnights. It was, in short, human. And if it doesn't sound like a 5-star resort, remember that the people who lived this way weren't writing Yelp reviews. They were surviving, thriving, and sometimes, believe it or not, were probably sleeping better than we do now with all our gadgets.
Dreams, rituals, and the quiet life of night. All right, so far we've talked about bedding, furs, family piles, cradle boards, and fires that doubled as tiny night spas. But sleep wasn't just about staying warm or avoiding frostbite. For many Native American cultures, sleep carried meaning beyond the physical. Dreams, night rituals, and subtle spiritual practices intertwined with nightly rest, and sometimes even dictated how bedding was arranged. Let's start with dreams. Yes, you're allowed to imagine them as fluffy, mystical clouds, but let's keep it grounded. Dreams mattered.
The Ojibwe, for example, had elaborate beliefs about dreams. They thought dreams could carry messages from spirits or provide guidance for hunting, healing, and decision-making. And because dreams were important, sleep was treated carefully. People didn't just flop down wherever. They often prepared a specific spot to lie, sometimes facing a particular direction or surrounded by charms, bundles, or sacred objects. Think of it as a spiritual sleep hygiene. Modern humans have lavender sprays and guided meditations. These cultures had herbs, medicine bundles, and the quiet presence of ancestors. And dreams weren't always private. Among certain plains tribes, a person might sleep near a fire, but with a protective circle of objects or family members so that any message from the dream world wouldn't get lost or stolen. Yes, dream theft was a concept. Some people believed that spirits could inadvertently or deliberately interfere with dreams, or that one person's dream could influence another's sleep. It's a bit more complicated than go to sleep and wake up in 8 hours, but it shows the intertwining of culture and rest. Now on to the more tangible rituals. Fires, blankets, and even furs could be arranged with spiritual intention. For example, the Cherokees sometimes laid bundles of certain herbs or plants near sleeping areas to protect against evil spirits or bad dreams. The Hopi placed particular mats or blankets in ceremonial alignment. And yes, if you're picturing this as obsessive, you're not wrong. But it wasn't OCD. It was a way of acknowledging that sleep had layers: physical comfort, social proximity, and metaphysical safety. Let's pause for a moment to appreciate the irony. European colonists often wrote in endless journals about how ignorant or superstitious native peoples were for performing these rituals. Yet the same European societies were obsessed with their own bedtime superstitions: amulets for children, lucky charms, and hours of prayer before sleep. Somehow, the criticism was always one way. It seems that if a Native American believed in the protective power of a dream bundle, that was backward. If an English lady sprinkled holy water on her pillows, that was, well, perfectly reasonable. History has a sense of humor, if you squint. Now, let's gently explore the connection between night and communal life. Sleeping together wasn't just about warmth, it was about connection, about passing down stories, songs, and quiet teaching moments. Parents whispered instructions. Older siblings shared knowledge, and even the act of arranging mats or furs could be a lesson in responsibility. In some plains tribes, the position of a sleeping child or adult could reflect social roles, age, or readiness to join certain activities at dawn. Sleeping was practical, yes, but also subtly structured. And speaking of structure, let's return briefly to the fire. We've mentioned it a lot because it was central. But beyond warmth and light, fires had symbolic significance. The smoke and embers created a protective, almost sacred space. The placement of mats relative to the fire could be ritualistic. People oriented themselves to the stars and moon, sometimes sleeping with their heads towards sacred directions. Again, there's a gentle irony here. Europeans looked at a smoky lodge and thought, how primitive. But the layout, the airflow, and the careful positioning were all deliberate. Efficiency met symbolism, something our modern homes rarely accomplish in such a poetic way. Now, let's float to another fascinating, if subtle, point: seasonal adjustments. Sleep wasn't static. As the year changed, so did bedding, fire placement, and even sleeping posture. In summer, people often moved mats closer to breezes, or slept on rooftops or elevated platforms to catch cool air. In winter, furs and hides multiplied, and fire pits might be extended for optimal warmth. Even segmented sleep adapted: longer stretches when nights were frigid, shorter naps when the sun rose early. Humans have always been flexible creatures. Sleep was a living system, not a rigid routine. Another note for our sleepy appreciation: the role of storytelling. Nighttime in a lodge, teepee, or wigwam was often punctuated by gentle narration. Not the loud, dramatic storytelling we imagine today, but soft, measured tales. Sometimes these were legends, sometimes practical guidance, how to track animals, how to recognize medicinal plants, or how to behave on a hunting expedition. And while this might have extended waking hours, it also helped lull people into sleep with the rhythm of voice and repetition. Think of it as the original audiobooks, without the Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. Let's also not ignore humor. Yes, even in the dim glow of a fire, people laughed quietly at the antics of children, animals, or exaggerated stories. Sleep wasn't solemn. It was a gentle transition from one state of awareness to another. After all, humor helps humans relax. And if you've ever laughed quietly while lying awake, you know exactly what I mean. Now, European observers frequently contrasted this with their own nighttime practices. In castles or cottages, sleep was often solitary, drafty, and rigidly structured. Nobility might have elaborate feather beds and curtains, but peasants sometimes shared one straw mattress with half the family. And yet somehow, the narrative was always that native sleep was inferior. Again, irony, just floating along in the historical river. Before we drift to the next part, let's reflect on one final nuance: adaptability. Native sleeping arrangements were remarkably versatile. Tipis could be packed and moved for the bison hunt. Wigwams could be rebuilt after storms. Mats could be repurposed. Cradle boards allowed mobility for families on the move. Sleep wasn't just comfort, it was strategy. It responded to climate, to family, to community, and to spiritual beliefs. And when Europeans scoffed at this, they often failed to see that flexibility was in fact a form of ingenuity. So to wrap up Part 3, gently, sleep for Native Americans was layered, communal, adaptable, and imbued with meaning. It wasn't just laying down on the ground, as caricatures suggest. It was considered, intentional, and surprisingly sophisticated. From dream protection to seasonal adjustments, from family teaching moments to quiet humor by the fire, the night was full of life, even as it lulled people toward rest. And somewhere between the smoke of the fire, the whisper of the wind, and the soft weight of furs, human beings were practicing what might be the most subtle and gentle art of all: falling asleep well. In Part 4, we'll move toward the interactions between Native Americans and Europeans and how these sleeping habits, surprisingly, influenced early colonial camps, forts, and explorers' tents. Because, of course, nothing in history stays untouched for long.
So, by now, you might be imagining Native Americans snuggled in teepees or wigwams, babies strapped to cradle boards, fires crackling, and everyone drifting off under layered furs. Cozy, right? But history, of course, loves irony. Because as Europeans arrived on these shores, they didn't just scoff, they learned. Slowly, painfully, and sometimes with minor, sarcastically delightful complaints. Let's start with tents. European explorers and soldiers were accustomed to canvas or wool shelters, often poorly ventilated and heavier than a small car. Move them onto the Great Plains or into the forests of the Northeast, and suddenly they were encountering portable homes that made their own tents look absurd. Teepees, with their cone shape, smoke flaps, and efficient warmth, were light, adaptable, and surprisingly resilient in bad weather. A European officer might grumble in his diary about how uncivilized this structure appeared. Yet the next winter, he'd quietly set up a similar arrangement for himself, because frostbite waits for no one. And the wigwam? Europeans often dismissed it as childishly small or primitive, yet it offered insulation, protection from rain, and a surprisingly comfortable sleep surface. While colonists slept on hard floors or straw mats, sometimes sharing space with livestock for warmth, wigwams provided a cleaner, more efficient alternative. Inevitably, some European settlers adopted these designs, particularly in frontier areas. Yes, they might have called it savage ingenuity in writing, but the practical reality spoke louder than words. Humans sleep better when they're warm and dry.
Now, the cross-cultural borrowing wasn't limited to the structure itself. Bedding practices traveled as well. Layered furs, mats, and blankets began showing up in colonial camps, largely because European fabrics weren't always available or effective. Survival dictated innovation. If you were a soldier in 18th century North America, you didn't have the luxury of a feather mattress shipped from England. You had to learn from the people who had been mastering sleep on the land for centuries. And yes, they grumbled about the smell, the smoke, and the insect, but hey, it worked. Cradle boards also caught the eye of European observers. Not that they always understood them correctly. Some diaries contain bewildered accounts of babies strapped upright to boards for hours, sometimes outdoors, sometimes propped near a fire. To a European mother used to swaddling infants in cloth and placing them in baskets, this seemed shocking. Yet anthropologists now believe that cradle boards were a practical and safe solution, particularly in mobile societies. Some Europeans even borrowed the idea, though often adapting it in clumsier ways. Imagine trying to strap your infant upright on a rigid wooden frame and calling it modern convenience. The babies, meanwhile, remained unimpressed. Another layer of influence came from sleep segmentation. Europeans, conditioned to long stretches of uninterrupted sleep, found themselves awake at odd hours, shivering or pacing in unfamiliar climates. Observing native customs, sleeping in shifts, tending fires, and using night hours for quiet tasks, they gradually adopted more flexible sleep patterns. Diaries from the 17th century contain references to settlers awakening in the middle of the night to tend embers, or staying quietly until the moon reached a certain height. Not as mystical as dream bundles, but functional. It turns out that segmented sleep has practical advantages, particularly when temperatures fluctuate wildly overnight. And yes, let's pause to appreciate the subtle humor here. Europeans criticized native habits, copied them silently, and then wrote about how much worse the Europeans had it. History is rarely fair, and even more rarely quiet. Imagine a British officer shivering in a flimsy tent while noting the primitive genius of the people whose designs kept everyone else warm. That's bedtime irony at its finest. Now, beyond tents and bedding, there were spiritual and cultural borrowings, or at least acknowledgments. Europeans observed night rituals, dream protection, and fire arrangements, sometimes dismissing them as superstition, sometimes quietly appreciating the practical outcomes. For example, positioning sleeping areas near a fire but not too close created a balance of warmth and safety. European camps eventually adopted similar layouts, with cooking fires double duty as night heaters, careful spacing to avoid sparks, and communal sleeping arrangements for warmth. And yet, Europeans never fully grasped the deeper significance. Where a native family might sleep facing a particular direction for spiritual or symbolic reasons, settlers often ignored orientation, focusing purely on pragmatism. They might have used the same techniques for warmth or convenience, but without the cultural layer that made them meaningful. Sleep became functional, stripped of spiritual nuance, a utilitarian shadow of what they observed. Children's sleep practices also influenced European communities, particularly in frontier areas. Cradle boards and communal sleeping setups taught settlers that infants could be kept safe and warm in environments Europeans hadn't designed for survival. Some even adopted night fire practices or indoor arrangements to mimic warmth, though rarely embracing the full symbolism or communal philosophy behind them. Practicality trumped ritual, as it so often does in survival situations. And here is a gentle, slightly ironic thought. The very people who had colonized, conquered, and claimed superiority over native peoples ended up learning basic survival lessons from them. Sleep, something we all take for granted, was a domain where knowledge transfer occurred quietly, invisibly, without fanfare. Europeans were sleeping better because of native ingenuity, and often without acknowledgement. Perhaps they snored in shame. And lastly, let's consider mobility. European armies were trained for stationary encampments or rigid marching camps. Native practices, refined over centuries, emphasized rapid setup, breakdown, and relocation. Tipis could be disassembled and packed in hours. Wigwams, though heavier, were rebuilt efficiently. European soldiers eventually borrowed portable designs, lightweight materials, and even nighttime routines to maintain effectiveness on the move. Once again, survival dictated adaptation, and sleep became a subtle battlefield advantage. So, as we drift to a close for Part 4, the picture becomes clear. Native American sleep practices, layered bedding, cradle boards, tents, smoke flaps, communal warmth, fire positioning, seasonal adjustment, and even spiritual orientation were observed, often ridiculed, but quietly adopted by Europeans. Comfort, adaptability, and survival were the primary goals, but culture and symbolism added layers of meaning. Europeans gained warmth, practicality, and occasionally a smidge of humility, even if they didn't quite know how to process it. In Part 5, we'll gently wander into regional variations, comparing sleeping arrangements across tribes, climates, and landscapes. Plains, forests, deserts, and mountains each produced subtly different strategies, and yes, some of them were very clever and slightly funny from a modern perspective.
All right, so far we've drifted through bedding, cradle boards, fires, dreams, spiritual rituals, and even the grudging adoption of native sleep practices by Europeans. Now it's time to gently wander through the vast North American landscapes and see how environment influenced how people slept. Because yes, a teepee in the plains is not the same as a hogan in the desert or a wigwam in the forest. And if you're still awake, that's perfect. We're about to float through geography in the gentlest, sleepiest way possible. Let's start with the Great Plains, where the teepees ruled. These were vast expanses of grassland, hot in summer, freezing in winter, and occasionally trampled by bison herds just for fun. Teepees were ingenious, conical, ventilated, portable, and surprisingly warm when layered with hides. Winter sleep involved thick buffalo hides, mats woven from grasses, and careful placement around the central fire. Families often slept in a circle, heads toward the center, feet outward, to maximize warmth and proximity. Babies were strapped to cradle boards nearby. Adults shared furs, and sometimes dogs curled at the edges, adding extra warmth. It was cozy, mobile, and efficient, a portable microcosm of home. Contrast that with the eastern woodlands, home to the Iroquois, Algonquins, and other forest-dwelling peoples. Here, wigwams dominated, rounded, semi-permanent structures covered with bark or reed mats. Insulation was excellent. Drafty nights were rare. Sleep arrangements involved layered mats and furs, often on raised platforms or benches. Seasonal shifts mattered. Floors were cleared of leaves in summer, padded with moss or grass in winter. Babies still had cradle boards, but the communal arrangement often meant several adults and children shared the same space, enhancing warmth and social cohesion. European observers frequently remarked on the cozy ingenuity of these homes, even while calling the inhabitants uncivilized. Classic. Now, let's drift southwest, where deserts demanded a different approach. The Navajo, Hopi, and Pueblo peoples lived in hogans, adobe homes, or cliff dwellings. Sleep here involved careful attention to temperature. Thick adobe walls kept interiors cool in summer and retained heat in winter. Mats and furs were still used, but elevated platforms were common, especially to catch breezes or stay above damp floors. Seasonal adjustments were crucial. In summer, people might sleep on rooftops, gazing at stars and enjoying desert winds. Winter brought insulation with extra furs and indoor fires. Even cradle boards and children's sleeping practices adapted to these climates. Babies were swaddled, bundled, and kept close, with ventilation carefully considered to avoid overheating. Let's not forget the Pacific Northwest, with its damp, rainy climate. Tribes like the Coast Salish and Tlingit used longhouses, large wooden structures housing extended families.
Here, communal sleep took on a grander scale. Mats laid on wooden planks, often raised above the wet ground, fires at intervals, and infants carefully placed for warmth and safety. The damp climate meant constant attention to ventilation and moisture control. Furs, blankets, and woven mats were essential. Sleeping arrangements often mirrored social structures, with certain sections reserved for elders, others for young adults or children. It was organized chaos, and it worked. Now, across all regions, there was one common theme. Humans are adaptable. Heat, cold, humidity, wind, and precipitation all influenced sleep arrangements. Bedding, shelter design, fire placement, and family arrangements were all responses to environmental pressures. And yet, Europeans often ignored this logic, criticizing practices that made perfect sense in context. The irony, of course, is delicious. Settlers later borrowed tents, bedding techniques, and fire layouts once they realized survival demanded it. Sleep, it turns out, was one of the quietest areas of cultural exchange, and perhaps one of the most effective.
All right, let's settle in for a gentle exploration of European forays into the world of Native American sleep. By now, it should be clear that Native practices were practical, communal, and remarkably adaptive. Europeans, however, had a different approach. Skepticism first, adoption reluctantly, and a chronic tendency to overcomplicate everything. Diaries and letters from explorers, soldiers, and settlers reveal a mix of admiration, confusion, and outright exasperation. Take, for example, a French officer on the Great Plains in the early 18th century. His diary entry reads something like this: "The natives sleep upon the ground with hides and furs in structures they call tipis. The smoke rises above their heads, yet they seem unbothered. I do not understand how they survive the cold. My own bedding, though superior in fluff, fails me utterly." And yet, by the next winter, the same officer quietly rearranged his own camp to mimic the tipis, complete with furs and central fire. He didn't brag about it. There's no medal for admitting the indigenous design is superior, apparently. Similarly, in the forests of the Northeast, British and French settlers tried to replicate wigwams. Early attempts were challenging. Bark and reed mats are harder to fashion than European tents, particularly if you're accustomed to canvas and nails. Some settlers ended up with leaky roofs, uneven floors, and a general sense that Native Americans were somehow laughing at them silently. Diaries contain complaints about smoke inhalation, uneven mats, and even occasional critters, as if European discomfort somehow invalidated centuries of indigenous knowledge. Spoiler, it didn't. Children's sleep was another source of bewilderment. Cradle boards, swaddling techniques, and upright infant positioning baffle European observers. Some tried to create their own versions, only to find infants uncomfortable or overly squirmy. It turns out that centuries of adaptation, tiny adjustments for climate, age, and mobility cannot be perfectly copied in a single afternoon. Yet Europeans persisted, often grumbling that savages had invented a system that baffled them. History, as always, enjoys irony. Fire placement was another subtle complication. Europeans initially assumed that one fire in a central location was sufficient. Native practice, however, often involved multiple fires or careful positioning to control warmth, ventilation, and smoke. Settlers who ignored this soon discovered that they were either freezing or choking. Eventually, many quietly adopted multiple hearths, offset fireplaces, or the classic small contained fire strategy, without ever admitting the lesson came from native insight. And let's pause for a gentle laugh here. European diary writers occasionally complained about the smell of furs or the inconvenience of dogs in the lodge. These were precisely the same concerns native communities managed with grace. Dogs provided warmth and security. Furs kept people from freezing. Europeans, unused to practicality over aesthetics, had a learning curve. Some letters even describe settlers trying to ban dogs from their improvised wigwams, only to wake shivering in the middle of the night, realizing the dogs were actually essential. Now, let's float to something slightly absurd: European obsession with perfection. Whereas Native Americans adapted to irregular floors, smoke, and shifting weather, Europeans attempted rigid arrangements. Mats must be perfectly aligned, fires exactly measured, bedding evenly fluffed. The results? Frequent complaints, minor injuries, and chronic irritation. Native Americans, by contrast, slept with flexibility, comfort, and an almost meditative acceptance of imperfection. Europeans would learn eventually, or at least adapt grudgingly. Another diary gem. A British officer in the Ohio Valley writes about attempting to adopt segmented sleep. He tried to wake, check embers, and then resume slumber. Predictably, he woke cranky, cold, and confused. Meanwhile, the native family around him quietly continued their rhythm, perfectly in sync with fire, wind, and night. Europeans rarely understood that sleep wasn't just an isolated activity. It was integrated into community life, climate, and ritual. Their attempts to isolate and regiment it often failed. And of course, Europeans were fascinated, if reluctantly, by summer sleeping practices. Sleeping on rooftops, mats arranged for breezes, fireless nights in warm climates. All of this seemed novel, exotic, and somehow unnecessary. Yet practicality won out again. Even settlers in the Southwest eventually adopted rooftop or elevated sleeping platforms to avoid the heat, mimicking centuries of Pueblo experience. They didn't call it learning from the natives, of course. That would have been polite. Let's gently consider one final European experiment: portability. Tipis, in particular, forced Europeans to confront their own cumbersome tents. French trappers and scouts found themselves struggling with heavy canvas, while native neighbors disassembled a teepee in under 2 hours and packed it onto horses. The solution? Eventually, lighter frameworks, smaller tents, and even partial adoption of smoke flaps appeared in settler camps. Efficiency, in this case, was learned by observation and quietly acknowledged in grumbling footnotes. So, by the end of Part 6, a clear pattern emerges. Europeans observed, criticized, and slowly adapted. Bedding, cradle boards, fires, tent design, segmented sleep, and even seasonal adjustments all filtered into colonial practice, but rarely without sarcasm or diary complaints. Native ingenuity quietly shaped European survival, often without recognition. And as humans have always done, sleep remained a universal, unifying, and quietly competitive domain.
Communal life and the quiet art of sleeping together. All right, so far we've seen how Native Americans slept: fires, furs, cradle boards, seasonal adjustments, and Europeans awkwardly copying it all. But let's float into the subtler layers of night, the social, communal, and quietly complex world of sleeping together. Because sleep wasn't just a private affair. It was part of the fabric of life. Let's start with families. In most tribes, homes were shared spaces, often with extended family under one roof. Babies slept near parents, young children clustered together, and even older relatives weren't isolated. Privacy, as we imagine it today, was a luxury. Instead, warmth, supervision, and connection were paramount. If a baby cried in the middle of the night, the sound traveled softly through the lodge or teepee.
A parent or older sibling responded quickly, without waking the entire household. The communal arrangement created both safety and rhythm, a subtle, human form of orchestration. And yes, there was hierarchy. Sleeping arrangements could reflect age, status, or social role. Elders often had prime positions, closer to the central fire, on slightly raised platforms, or in sections considered spiritually significant. Adults with particular responsibilities might sleep near entrances or key areas, ready to respond to emergencies or guide children. Children were typically placed near caregivers, but blankets and furs allowed flexibility. Even within communal sleeping, order and social cues mattered. Europeans often failed to grasp this, imagining chaos, when in reality it was structured, intuitive, and culturally encoded. Dogs, again, played a dual role. They weren't merely pets, they were living heaters, guardians, and sometimes comforting companions. In communal arrangements, dogs curled near the edges of sleeping areas, alert to danger, but also providing warmth. European observers often complained about this, but settlers eventually realized that having a dog in the lodge improved both comfort and safety. Nighttime was a shared ecosystem. Humans, animals, and even fire all interacting quietly, in harmony, for survival and well-being. Let's float gently into the rituals that accompanied communal sleep. Fires were carefully tended, not only for warmth, but also for rhythm. A dying fire meant movement. Someone would add more wood, someone else might adjust blankets or mats, and children were quietly soothed. Evening storytelling, whispering, or even soft singing helped transition from wakefulness to rest. Humor and light commentary were common, a gentle way to settle the household into sleep. And yes, Europeans occasionally observed this with confusion, remarking that it was odd to see a family laughing quietly while preparing for bed. In context, it was perfectly ordinary. Another layer was spiritual and symbolic. Certain sleeping positions, arrangements, or directions carried meaning. Some tribes aligned sleeping areas toward particular stars, sacred mountains, or cardinal points. Fires and mats were not randomly placed. They created balance, protected against perceived spirits, and reinforced social structure. Dreams, as we've noted before, were integrated into communal life. People sleeping together could share insights, protect infants, and maintain continuity of cultural knowledge, all under the gentle rhythm of night. Now let's pause to consider adaptability. Communal sleeping had to respond to seasons, climate, and social changes. In harsh winters, everyone huddled closer to fires and each other. In milder seasons, mats were spread out for comfort, air, and space. Children's placements shifted with age and mobility. Even visitors were accommodated, sometimes with mats temporarily added to the lodge or teepee. Flexibility was key. Europeans, with their rigid bedding expectations, struggled to adopt this dynamic approach. And let's also consider humor again, softly. Diaries record subtle exasperation as settlers attempted communal arrangements. "Where does one place oneself without violating hierarchy?" asked one English officer, bewildered by the logic of elders' positions. Children's laughter and playful interactions sometimes punctuated the night, helping everyone relax before sleep. This was sleep as social practice, quiet, rhythmic, and gently reinforcing community bonds. And speaking of rhythm, Europeans occasionally tried segmented sleep within communal arrangements, often failing spectacularly. They would wake at odd hours, add fuel to fires, fumble with blankets, and complain loudly, while native families continued their practiced, gentle routine. Observation alone was insufficient. One had to absorb the rhythm of life, the subtle cues of fire, breath, and social expectation. This is one reason European diaries often mix admiration with exasperation. They saw genius, but struggled to replicate it. Now let's drift toward a slightly ironic detail. Even within communal living, individuality mattered. Elders, adults with special duties, or those with particular spiritual roles, had slightly different sleeping routines. Babies and toddlers were closely monitored, but older children might be allowed quiet independence, so long as it didn't compromise warmth or safety. Dogs, blankets, furs, fire, all of these were flexible, shared resources, yet they were subtly regulated. It was communal without chaos, coordinated without fanfare. So, as Part 7 gently closes, we see that sleep in Native American life was social, adaptive, and culturally encoded. Communal arrangements reinforced family structure, ensured safety, facilitated teaching, and supported spiritual practice. Europeans learned these lessons slowly, often awkwardly, and sometimes with grumbling commentary. Sleep wasn't merely an individual act, it was a shared, dynamic, living system.
Now, we floated through bedding, fires, cradle boards, communal arrangements, and even European attempts at imitation. But sleep didn't exist in a vacuum. It moved with the seasons, aligned with festivals, and sometimes intertwined with ceremonial life. Because night was not just the time to close your eyes, it was part of the subtle rhythm of life itself. Let's start with seasons. The Northern Hemisphere experiences significant variation in daylight, temperature, and weather. Native American communities adapted to these changes with remarkable subtlety. In winter, nights were long and bitter. Fires were central, furs piled high, and communal huddling was essential. Babies were kept closest to adults in fires. Older children clustered for warmth. Sleep segmentation often extended. People would wake to tend fires, add wood, or adjust bedding. European observers occasionally marveled or grumbled about these odd wake-up routines, missing entirely that the rhythm was survival. Summer brought entirely different strategies. Nights were shorter, air warmer, and many tribes moved sleep outdoors or to elevated platforms. Rooftops in desert regions, breezy clearings in forests, and open plains under stars became nighttime bedrooms. Furs were lighter or removed entirely. Fires were smaller or absent. Cradleboards adapted to ventilation and comfort. Communal arrangements remained, but with more space to accommodate heat and airflow. Europeans observing this often expressed envy, quietly noting that people slept soundly under the stars without blankets, tents, or fuss. Now, festivals and ceremonies also influenced sleep. Many tribes held seasonal celebrations, harvest festivals, vision quests, winter solstice rituals, or sundance events. Nights during these periods were often interrupted by ritual activities, extended socializing, or ceremonial fires. Sleep adapted to the occasion. Mats were moved aside, fires tended for extended warmth, and families sometimes slept in larger groups to accommodate visitors or ceremonial participants. Sleep wasn't neglected, it was flexible, responsive, and integrated into social and spiritual life. Europeans rarely appreciated this, often dismissing dreams as trivial or superstitious, while native communities treated them with quiet seriousness. Let's drift toward the role of children during seasonal and ceremonial nights. Babies remained swaddled in cradleboards, sometimes near ceremonial fires, while older children learned rituals through observation. Soft storytelling, lullabies, or whispered instructions bridged sleep and education. Sleep was part of learning and socialization, a gentle integration of family, culture, and daily rhythm. Europeans occasionally tried to imitate this by keeping children nearby during festivals, but often missed the nuance of ritual timing or spiritual context. Animals continued their quiet contributions. Dogs curled at the edges of communal sleeping spaces, alert to predators or wandering strangers. Even ceremonial nights relied on the presence of animals. They were part of warmth, safety, and daily life. Europeans often failed to see the subtle brilliance here,
until they woke shivering and realized the dog was indeed essential. And of course, Europeans marveled at the adaptability of mats, furs, and bedding during festivals. Mats could be rearranged to accommodate larger gatherings, furs could be shifted for warmth or comfort. Tipis and wigwams could be expanded temporarily for visitors. Sleep remained integrated with life, rather than isolated as a personal activity. Diaries from settlers record a mix of admiration and exasperation, a recurring theme throughout history. Let's pause for a gentle laugh. Europeans sometimes struggled to combine their civilized bedtime routines with festival nights. They would try to maintain strict schedules while observing dances, feasts, and rituals, only to find themselves exhausted and bewildered. Meanwhile, native communities maintained flexibility, rhythm, and comfort, all while participating fully in ceremonial life. It's the quiet, practical genius of adaptation in action. Finally, seasonal sleep arrangements also tied into food and resource management. During hunting or harvesting periods, people often slept near food stores or cooking areas to monitor supplies and protect them from pests. Winter caches required careful placement and sometimes late-night attention. These adjustments weren't arbitrary, they were deeply practical. Sleep, survival, and social life were entwined. Europeans, with their rigid assumptions, often failed to grasp the subtle coordination at play. So, as Part 8 gently concludes, we can see that sleep was far from static. It moved with the sun and moon, aligned with festivals, adjusted to temperature and climate, and intertwined with spiritual and ceremonial practice. Native Americans cultivated a dynamic, adaptive, and communal rhythm of rest that supported physical survival, social cohesion, and cultural continuity. Europeans learned some lessons, often grudgingly, but rarely captured the elegance of the system. In Part 9, we'll gently explore the intersection of health, hygiene, and sleep, including how native practices minimized disease, maximized comfort, and supported longevity in a pre-modern world. Because even in sleep, humans are remarkably pragmatic.
So far, we've wandered through bedding, communal arrangements, seasonal adjustments, and ceremonial influences. But sleep wasn't just comfort or ritual. It was also remarkably practical when it came to health and hygiene. Native American communities developed subtle practices that supported wellness, reduced disease risk, and even improved sleep quality, long before modern science bothered to notice. Let's begin with ventilation. Tipis, wigwams, and hogans were all designed with airflow in mind. Smoke flaps, offset fireplaces, and elevated platforms allowed fresh air to circulate while keeping warmth centralized. Europeans, by contrast, often crammed into tents with minimal airflow, complaining about drafts, smoke, or the occasional unpleasant odor. The irony is delicious. Native designs optimized for respiratory health while maintaining warmth. Settlers eventually copied such practices, though begrudgingly, but always with a grumble and a note about primitive ingenuity. Next, consider bedding hygiene. Furs, mats, and hides were rotated, aired out, and sometimes exposed to smoke or sunlight to deter pests. Cradle boards kept infants off the ground, reducing exposure to dampness, insects, and pathogens. Adults and children alike slept on surfaces that were practical, often washable in indirect ways, and tailored to seasonal needs. Europeans sometimes mocked these measures as ritualistic or excessive, but they worked. The fact that settlers eventually copied such practices, though begrudgingly, speaks volumes. Fire management also contributed to health. Central fires provided warmth, cooked food, and controlled insect populations. They also created a controlled environment. Smoke acted as a mild disinfectant, and the heat kept bedding dry, minimizing fungal or bacterial growth. Europeans often underestimated this. Many diaries note shivering settlers in wet tents, failing to recognize that the native approach to fire placement was as much about health as comfort. Sleep positions and arrangements played a role too. Elevating the head slightly or arranging mats to avoid drafts helped regulate body temperature and supported respiratory health. Babies in cradle boards had their heads positioned carefully to allow airflow while maintaining warmth. Older children and adults similarly adjusted positions to avoid discomfort or illness. These were subtle adaptations, hardly medical interventions, but effective in a pre-modern context. Let's gently float to communal hygiene. Shared sleeping areas encouraged mutual monitoring. If a child or adult became ill, others noticed quickly. Adjustments were made, blankets shifted, fires tended, and caregivers positioned near the sick to provide warmth and care. Sleep was integrated with community health rather than treated as an isolated personal activity. Europeans, with their often rigid individualistic notions of bedchambers, sometimes failed to recognize this as a preventative system. Seasonal adjustments also supported health. In winter, extra furs and clustered sleeping minimized exposure to cold and frostbite. In summer, mats were spread out, ventilation increased, and fires minimized, reducing the risk of overheating or smoke inhalation. Even the orientation of sleeping areas toward airflow, sun exposure, or protective terrain had practical implications for wellness. Animals played another quiet role in hygiene. Dogs were generally clean, alert, and part of the community system. They provided warmth and protection without introducing excessive mess. In contrast, European settlements sometimes struggled with sanitation when animals were kept outside or bedding was reused without rotation. Native practices, while communal, maintained a subtle equilibrium that supported health and comfort. Another point worth noting is mental health, gently woven into sleep practices. The rhythmic nature of nightly routines, fire tending, gentle storytelling, cradle board swaddling, and shared warmth created psychological comfort. The integration of sleep with family, ritual, and community offered a predictable, soothing framework. Europeans occasionally noted oddly contented children or remarkably peaceful nights, but rarely connected these observations to cultural practices. Finally, let's touch on seasonal illness management. During times of scarcity or harsh weather, sleeping arrangements shifted to maximize safety and warmth. Vulnerable individuals, elderly, sick, or young, were prioritized in proximity to fire, blankets, or caregivers. This flexible, community-centered approach minimized the spread of illness and protected vulnerable members. Europeans, used to more static sleeping arrangements, struggled to replicate this level of adaptability. So, as Part 9 gently closes, we see that Native American sleep practices were more than comfort or ritual. They were integrated with health, hygiene, and survival strategy. Ventilation, fire management, bedding rotation, cradle board use, communal observation, seasonal adjustments, and even psychological comfort all contributed to wellness. Europeans learned some of these lessons, albeit grudgingly, and sometimes only after a season or two of shivering and sleepless nights.
By now, we've meandered through bedding, fires, cradle boards, communal routines, seasonal adjustments, ceremonial nights, and health-focused strategies. But sleep, like culture, doesn't vanish with time. It evolves, adapts, and sometimes quietly influences the future. Native American sleep practices left subtle but enduring footprints, particularly in colonial life and modern survival methods. Let's start with tents. The teepee, with its conical design, smoke flops, and portability, influenced European settlers' temporary structures. French trappers, British soldiers, and frontier families gradually adapted lighter, more efficient tents modeled after native designs. While diaries often insisted on our superior European ingenuity, the truth is quietly obvious. Teepees were just better for the climate and mobility of the plains.
Even modern camping tents borrow elements from this design, especially the central pole structure, ventilation principles, and wind resistance. Sleep outdoors hasn't changed as much as Europeans once thought. Wigwams and hogams also left their mark. European settlers occasionally adopted bark-covered shelters, semi-permanent huts, or adobe-style homes in desert and forested regions. The lessons were subtle. Insulation matters, ventilation matters, and the right shelter can make or break sleep quality. Modern interpretations, cabin design, eco-lodges, and wilderness shelters echo these centuries-old principles. European settlers often ignored the cultural or spiritual significance, but they did replicate the practical elements. Cradle boards are another enduring legacy. European settlers in frontier regions borrowed the concept, if not the exact form, of upright infant carriers. Modern baby carriers, car seats, and portable cribs owe a surprising depth to these early innovations. Functionality, mobility, and infant safety were core principles that transcended culture, silently influencing childcare in a variety of contexts. Seasonal and communal sleeping patterns also influenced settler routines. The segmented sleep observed in native communities, periods of rest punctuated by tending fires or checking surroundings, resonated with early colonial settlers. They may not have adopted the full cultural context, but practical adjustments were made. Heating strategies, fire placement, bedding rotations, and family clustering all subtly incorporated native practices. Even today, certain wilderness survival teachings emphasize layered sleep, shared warmth, and segmented rest as standard advice. Fire management techniques continue to influence modern camping. Centralized, offset, or multiple fires for warmth, cooking, and insect control echo centuries-old native strategies. Europeans learned these lessons over time, often after a night of shivering or being eaten alive by mosquitoes. And if you've ever slept near a campfire today, congratulations, you're practicing an age-old tradition. Dogs, too, retained their role in human sleep arrangements. Beyond companionship, their warmth, alertness, and protective instincts became quietly embedded in colonial and later frontier life. European settlers who once grumbled about canine proximity eventually realized dogs were essential for comfort and survival. Modern hikers and campers sometimes discover the same truth, though perhaps without the centuries of subtle cultural practice. Even ceremonial and ritual elements of sleep left traces. While European settlers rarely replicated spiritual orientations or dream practices, they did observe and sometimes adopt communal aspects of nighttime life. Gatherings, storytelling, and attentive care of infants became subtly integrated into frontier life. Sleep was no longer purely personal. It carried practical, social, and even emotional functions. Let's gently consider hygiene and health lessons. Bedding rotation, furs, elevated sleeping surfaces, and ventilation filtered into colonial survival strategies. Europeans learned that proper airflow prevents sickness, dry bedding prevents chills, and communal observation supports vulnerable members. Modern camping, survival guides, and even urban disaster preparedness echo these principles. Native American ingenuity created a blueprint for healthy, adaptive sleep that persists centuries later. Perhaps the most understated legacy is adaptability. Native American sleep practices were not rigid. They adjusted for climate, terrain, season, social structure, and individual needs. Europeans, initially rigid and frustrated, gradually embraced flexibility. Bedding arrangements shifted, fire placement adapted, and communal practices were modified. Today, anyone who has camped, backpacked, or spent a cold night outdoors is unknowingly paying homage to this centuries-old wisdom. And in a subtle, slightly ironic twist, modern sleep science has begun to rediscover what Native Americans practiced intuitively. Segmented sleep can be healthy. Exposure to natural light and darkness regulates circadian rhythms. Sleeping close to community or loved ones enhances psychological comfort. And flexible bedding arrangements support physical health. In other words, centuries of observation and adaptation were correct all along. Europeans may have doubted it, but science now quietly agrees. So, as Part 10 gently closes, the picture is clear. Native American sleep practices, tipis, wigwams, cradle boards, communal arrangements, seasonal adjustments, fire management, and adaptive routines were practical, culturally rich, and surprisingly influential. Europeans learned, adapted, and occasionally complained, leaving behind a quiet legacy that persists in modern camping, childcare, and survival strategies. Sleep, it turns out, is both timeless and transformative.
All right, we've traveled through centuries of bedding, tipis, wigwams, cradle boards, communal warmth, seasonal rhythms, ceremonial nights, hygiene, health, and even the subtle influence on European settlers. By now, we can gently pause and consider, what can we actually take from this ancient wisdom into our modern, mattress-filled, screen-lit lives? First, the obvious. Sleep is communal and social. Even if you live alone, there's something profoundly human about sharing warmth, stories, or even a pet at your feet. Native practices remind us that comfort, care, and awareness of others can quietly enhance rest. It's not about being crowded or losing privacy, it's about connection. Humans evolved in a world where sleep was intertwined with family, community, and rhythm. Modern isolation may be convenient, but it's worth remembering that social sleep structures once supported survival and psychological well-being. Next, adaptability matters. Native Americans shifted sleeping positions, bedding, and routines according to season, temperature, and circumstance. Europeans struggled until they learned to adapt. Today, flexibility is still useful. Adjusting blankets, sleepwear, temperature, or sleeping environment can make a big difference. Sleep isn't static. It moves with context, just as it always has. Environment is everything. Tipis, wigwams, and hogans were all designed for airflow, ventilation, insulation, and protection. Modern bedrooms rarely require smoke flaps, but principles like temperature control, airflow, and strategic bedding still apply. Sleeping in harmony with your environment, whether adjusting for heat, cold, or noise, is not just practical, it's timeless. Routine and rhythm also matter. Native Americans wove sleep into daily, seasonal, and ceremonial cycles. Even segmented sleep had purpose. Modern sleep science is rediscovering this. Consistent routines, awareness of natural light, and flexible timing all support restorative rest. Sometimes letting yourself wake briefly to adjust bedding, hydrate, or check on others is just fine. Humans are not designed for rigid, uninterrupted sleep every single night. Practicality over perfection is another quiet lesson. Europeans often struggled with native practices because they tried to perfect them without understanding context. Native Americans embraced flexibility, imperfection, and adaptation.
Modern sleepers could benefit from a similar approach. It's okay if your bedding isn't perfectly fluffed, your blanket slightly askew, or your pets curled at your feet. Comfort matters more than ritualized aesthetics. And of course, integration with nature. Sleeping outdoors, under stars, near fires, or in well-ventilated shelters all connected humans with natural cycles. Modern life often ignores this with artificial light, constant heating, and screens. Even small adjustments, opening windows, letting sunlight in, or considering natural temperature variations can improve sleep quality. Humans still respond to the rhythms that shaped our ancestors. And finally, there's humor and gentle observation. Europeans grumbled, settled awkwardly, and learned slowly. Native Americans, meanwhile, practiced efficiency with grace, even when visitors struggled to understand. We can take a subtle lesson here. Don't overcomplicate sleep. Observe your body, environment, and needs. Adjust, and maybe occasionally smile at your own awkward attempts at comfort. Sleep is practical, adaptive, communal, and sometimes quietly funny. So as we drift toward the gentle end of this journey, the overarching lesson is simple. Sleep is a living practice. It is woven with culture, climate, family, animals, fire, ritual, and intuition. Native Americans developed practices that maximized comfort, health, and community. Europeans learned, adapted, and sometimes grudgingly acknowledged the wisdom. Today, we can draw from these principles. Be flexible, respect environment, value community, and embrace the subtle rhythms that guide rest. If you dim the lights, arrange your bedding thoughtfully, maybe keep a pet nearby, and take a deep breath, you're not just sleeping, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back centuries. And perhaps that's quietly beautiful. So let yourself drift. Remember, comfort, rhythm, community, and adaptability are timeless. Sleep well, gently, and thoughtfully. And maybe, just maybe, notice how clever humans can be when they pay attention to the quiet art of resting.
All right. By now, we've wandered through nearly every major aspect of Native American sleep. Bedding, tipis, cradle boards, communal arrangements, seasonal adjustments, ceremonies, health, hygiene, and their subtle influence on Europeans and modern life. But sleep, as humans have long known, is full of little details that don't always make it into textbooks. And some of these tiny quirks are worth gently noting. Let's begin with nighttime sounds and scents. Europeans frequently commented on the quiet hum of life inside tipis and wigwams, the crackle of fire, soft breathing, the occasional stir of children, and the low murmur of conversation or whispers. Dogs padded along the edges, alert but unobtrusive. Mats shifted quietly under bodies settling in for the night. Even the smell of smoke, furs, and cooking fires created a distinctive nighttime atmosphere. Settlers found this oddly comforting or maddening, depending on how accustomed they were to silence or proper indoor living. Then there's the curious case of sleeping orientation. Certain tribes oriented sleeping mats toward cardinal points or natural landmarks. Some did this for spiritual reasons, some for practical climate control, and others simply because tradition dictated it. Europeans often ignored these subtleties, convinced it was superstition, until they noticed that the chosen directions minimized drafts or maximized warmth. Science, quietly, later agreed with the practical aspects. Another interesting detail: sleeping tools and minor innovations. Some tribes used pillows made of woven grasses, furs, or stuffed animal hides.
Mats were layered, sometimes doubled or tripled depending on season. Cradle boards were subtly adjustable. Infants could be swaddled tighter in winter and looser in summer. Even minor touches like slightly raised platforms or angled furs reflected centuries of observation and experimentation. Europeans often overlooked these nuances, thinking simplicity meant primitive design, until they tried it themselves and shivered, cramped, or woke with sore backs. Let's float to playful night rituals. Storytelling, lullabies, and whispered instructions often accompanied bedtime. These were subtle social tools, teaching children, reinforcing culture, or simply soothing nerves before sleep. European settlers sometimes misinterpreted these as distractions or unnecessary indulgences, failing to notice their practical and psychological function. The quiet artistry of such rituals contributed to calm, adaptive, and healthy sleep. Animals as nighttime companions deserve another gentle note. Beyond dogs, small animals sometimes curled near bedding or under mats, tolerated rather than indulged, contributing warmth or even pest control. Europeans often recoiled at such proximity, but Native Americans had long mastered the balance between utility and comfort. Nighttime life included humans, animals, and fire in a delicate, adaptive ecosystem. And yes, segmented sleep remains a subtle curiosity. Some European settlers found themselves mystified by families waking briefly to tend fires or check infants, only to return to slumber. Native Americans understood this as rhythm, not disruption. Life, after all, is continuous. Sleep is merely a part of it. Modern science now echoes this. Waking briefly during the night is natural and can even be restorative. Finally, a lingering reflection. Sleep is integrated, not isolated. It intersects with family, climate, culture, ceremony, health, animals, and community. Native practices remind us that sleep is as much about living well as resting. Europeans learned some lessons, modern science validates others, and the underlying principle remains timeless. Observe, adapt, and honor the quiet rhythms of the night. So as Part 12 gently closes, consider this your invitation to pause, breathe, and notice the small, overlooked aspects of sleep in your own life. Adjust your blankets, open a window, perhaps let a pet curl at your feet, and remember the centuries of subtle human observation that guide comfort, rhythm, and rest. Sleep, after all, is quietly brilliant.